we've been working through what is commonly referred to as a church calendar this year. And we've never done that before either. So the church calendar is broken into two halves. It's not the same as like our regular calendar year. It starts in late November, early December, and goes 12 months, but it's broken into really kind of two parts. There's what we call the church year, and then, or the sort of the year of Jesus, and then there's the church year. And the cycles repeat themselves. So the season of Advent kicks off the church calendar, and it's a season of anticipation. We're waiting for the birth of Jesus. And then Christmas, of course, is the celebration of Jesus' birth. And then you get this season that we're in right now, which is called the season of Epiphany. And the Epiphany is about proclamation. So we wait for Jesus to show up, Jesus shows up, and then we spend a season proclaiming who showed up. What is this God like? And then we'll repeat this cycle with Lent, Easter, and the season of Pentecost. So Lent is a season of anticipation. We're anticipating Jesus' death and resurrection. Easter is the season of celebration, and then Pentecost, again, is a season of proclamation. So this goes in cycles. So we're in this season of Epiphany. We're proclaiming who showed up at Christmas. All right, what is God like? And to answer that question, we look to the person of Jesus. And so we've been doing that, and we're going to continue to do that for a couple more weeks until we roll into this season of Lent. So this morning we're going to be in Luke chapter 6. This is Jesus. But to you who are willing to listen, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, offer the other cheek also. If someone demands your coat, offer your shirt also. Give to anyone who asks. And when things are taken away from you, don't try to get them back. Do to others as you would like them to do to you. If you love only those who love you, why should you get any credit for that? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good only to those who do good to you, why should you get credit? Even sinners do that much. And if you lend money only to those who can repay you, why should you get credit? Even sinners will lend to other sinners for a full return. Love your enemies. Do good to them. Lend to them without expecting to be repaid. Then your reward from heaven will be very great, and you will truly be acting as children of the Most High. For he's kind. For he's kind to those who are unthankful and wicked. You must be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. Well, I suppose we should start with that question, are you listening? In the NLT, it's to those who are willing to listen. The word willing is not actually there in the original language. It's just, are you listening? Jesus must have perceived that at least some of the people who were there weren't paying attention. Imagine that for a second. I mean, knowing now what we know about Jesus, imagine sitting in front of him and not listening to what he says. You don't have to work real hard. The church does this every Sunday. Right? We share what Jesus says, but unlike Peter, unlike Simon, remember a few weeks ago, Simon means listening with the intent of doing, listening intelligently. We often listen to Jesus with no intention of actually doing what he says. In fact, I'm guessing, even as I read those words, I do in my own mind. Even as you're listening to those words, some of you might be thinking, what does that even mean? How do I do that? What does that even look like? How could the world possibly work or operate if people actually did that? See, are you listening? Do you actually want to pay attention to what Jesus is saying? When you read the scriptures, it's important you read them in context. Jesus just got done. If you were here last week, Dustin took us through what are often called the Beatitudes. It's Jesus describing his alternative world, right? That God, through Christ, is inaugurating, starting a new world order. Essentially, what God is saying is, okay, this is how the world operates. I don't like that. That's not ever how I intended things to be. This is the way I intend for things to be. And through Christ, I'm turning that into this. So Jesus is describing this new world order, this alternative society, a different way of being human and a different way of doing human life corporately. It is challenging. I mean, he says things like, blessed are the poor and cursed are the rich. Well, most of us spend our entire lives trying to get rich. And Jesus says, cursed are the rich. That's dumb. When you think about it. Blessed are those who mourn, and cursed are those who laugh. Most of us have spent a lot of time of our lives mourning. We would never choose that. Why would you ever choose that? Blessed are the persecuted, and cursed are those whom the crowds applaud. Right? So if I were Jesus, as he's getting ready to launch into this next section, it makes sense to me that he would say, are you listening? It might as well say, are you still listening? Have I lost you? Did I insult you? Did I offend you? Did I anger you? Did I challenge you beyond your comfort level? Push you a little too much? You just tune out, right? You don't want to listen anymore. You want to get your phones out? Distract ourselves? Control where we're going to put our attention so we don't have to listen to things that we don't like? See, some people were still listening, but Jesus obviously assumed that some people were not. So you just ask yourself the question, are you listening? Do you really want to hear this? Do you really want to pay attention to what Jesus is saying? See, if the crowd was confused about this new world order that Jesus was bringing to bear on the earth, right? If they're hearing the Beatitudes and the blessings and the cursings and the woes and this sort of social reversal, he says, just in case you missed it, in case you were confused, in case you didn't understand what I was doing, he says, love your enemies. Punctuation mark. This is just me. If I had to pick 3 words that capture the fundamental difference between the kingdom of God and the world in which we all live, it's love your enemies. That's the difference. That in the kingdom of God, love of God is measured by love of neighbor, and love of neighbor is measured by love of enemy. It is the fundamental difference between what it means to live in God's world and what it means to live in a world apart from, divorced from God. I want you to think about what a radical thing this is to say. I mean, we read them as words on a page, and you get used to hearing it. That's why I read it out loud, and I read it slowly. Scripture is meant to be read out loud. It's meant to be heard. The Bible's a wonderful thing. It's amazing that we get to read it every day, but it wasn't originally read. It was originally spoken. You sit and you hear somebody say, love your enemies. Think about what a radical command that is. I mean, how easily do you make enemies? I mean, I love that song that Landon sang. Some of the imagery there about we see the next headline and we're right back to hating. But you think about how easily you make enemies in this world. People whom you are against, or whom you perceive to be against you. I mean, especially like on social media where you can do it from a distance. Smartphones are like our smart bombs. In the same way that we can send a bomb from thousands of miles away without any involvement, smartphones, we just boop, tweet. Facebook post here, a tweet there. Right? Smartphones are our smart bombs. It's so easy for us to just vilify people, categorize them, put them in a box, or even worse, totally write them off. Or literally, I care so little about you that you might as well be dead. You don't even exist to me anymore. Like I've literally just stopped listening to you. I never pay attention to anything you say because I've already convinced myself you're nuts. I mean, that's the world that we live in. We have grown very comfortable and very competent in a world of friends and foes, allies and enemies. People whom, we love and agree with and listen to, and they listen to us, whatever. And then people that we don't like at all, or we hate, or we don't even want to acknowledge that they exist. But Jesus says if you're going to follow me, you can't do that. Like you can't live that way and follow me. You cannot play that game. You cannot ever find yourself with the television on going, oh, that guy's such a, man, she's such a, they're such a, you cannot do that and follow Jesus Christ. Now, you may want to do that, but you can't do it. Jesus says, love your enemies. What a radical thing. It's totally different than the way that we operate in the world. Most of us, and I want you to just think about this for a second, because this is just something that I've observed hanging out with people. Most of us need someone or something to be against just so that we can feel alive. Is that there's something about us that's so unhappy or unfulfilled that the only way for us to even acknowledge that we exist is to have a problem with something. And when we don't have one, we make one up. We just create it. It's almost like the world exists by making enemies or making conflicts. It's like the fuel that drives the world. Yeah, I mean, am I talking crazy here? Have you ever been in a situation where you're like someone has a conflict or has a problem with something, and you're like, this is not a problem. What is going on right now that we're making this an issue? So Jesus says, love your enemies. Now, let's talk about this. What does he mean by love? What does that mean? In English, we have the word love. But we know that when we use that word, we mean different things. Well, in the Greek language, the language that our New Testament was originally written in, the Greek language has 3 words for love because it recognizes that there's nuance. So there's eros love or erotic love, romantic love. Jesus is not using that word. Surprise. There's phileo love. That's the love of friendship. The best way to think about it is the love that's associated with how you feel. Right, sort of a kinship. Okay, love. That's phileo. And then it's the love of the heart. And then there's what's called agape love. And agape is, if phileo is love of the heart, love of the feelings, the emotions, agape is love of the head. Agape is its choice, its commitment, its vow. And it's a vow based on a more foundational ethic. That's the word that Jesus uses. So when Jesus says love your enemies, he's not using erotic love. He's also not using friendship love. Essentially, he's saying, I don't care how you feel. I know feelings are so important to us. I don't care how you feel. Love your enemies. Agape your enemies. Choose to love your enemies. Make a choice, a commitment, a vow, based on something that's more foundational to who you are as a person, something that transcends your emotions, transcends how you feel. And that's why he can say things like, you do good to those who hate you. You bless those who curse you. You pray for those who hate you. Those are all choices. None of those are dependent on how you feel. In fact, those are all things that you can choose to do despite how you feel. They're choices. And the follower of Jesus makes the choice to love his enemies, to love her enemies, based on a more foundational truth or ethic. That's agape love. That's what Jesus is saying. Love your enemies. And we'll get back to that in a second. What does he mean by enemy? Who's the enemy? Don't answer that. I know you're all ready to answer that. That was not rhetorical. You're like, yeah, I know who the enemy is. Who's the enemy? I think this is important to talk about because I've heard Jesus' language here used in what I believe to be profoundly inappropriate ways. So when Jesus says, love your enemies, there's a verbal link here. So if you were here last week and you listened to the Beatitudes, you listened to Dustin's sermon, there's a verbal link between that section and this one. So in the Beatitudes, Jesus says, blessed are you whenever people persecute you or mock you or insult you or curse you or hate you because you follow me. Several of those words then show back up in this section where Jesus says, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who hate you. There's a verbal link here. So in my opinion, take it for what it's worth, I think when Jesus says enemy, he is specifically referring to people who reject you or insult you or mock you or harm you because you follow Jesus. And this is really important. So Jesus is not saying, hey, if you're in a relationship where your spouse is beating you, turn the other cheek. Jesus is not saying that. And I've heard his language used in that way. And I think that's horribly inappropriate. Jesus is not saying, be a doormat, just let people step all over you, no matter who it is or what they're doing or for what reason. Now listen, let me be clear. The command to love your enemies and to do good to your enemies stands regardless. Doesn't matter who the enemy is, doesn't matter what the enemy's doing, doesn't matter why. That stands. But this language of turning the other cheek, in Jesus' culture, that was a way of insulting someone. What Jesus is saying is that if you choose to follow me, you likely are going to be insulted. People are going to come after you in different ways. They're going to challenge you. They're going to mock you. And they're going to hate you. And when that happens, when you get insulted or mocked or hated or cursed because you have chosen to follow me, it's about following me. That's the reason that you're being mocked and insulted. When that happens, you need to do good to those who hate you. You need to bless those who curse you. You need to pray for those who hate you. So the injunction to love your enemies and to not retaliate, evil for evil, that stands regardless. Doesn't matter who the enemy is. I think that stands regardless as a follower of Christ. But I think it's really important to understand who Jesus is talking about here. That the enemy in question is the person who insults or mocks or hates or curses you because you follow him. Now, why would anybody do that? Why would anybody do that? I mean, what's so bad about following Jesus? I mean, think about it. Why would anybody in their right mind mock or insult or hate or curse someone simply because they're trying to follow the way of Christ? Well, come on, it's not hard to understand because it's different. That God in Christ is inaugurating a new world, a different way of being human in the world. You and I, we get up every day, and you live a narrative, whether you know you do or not. You have a script that you live by. And part of that script is how you were raised, and it's the culture in which we live, sort of this broader cultural narrative. There are values, there are hidden rules, just all sorts of things that we just have picked up as we've grown, and we now We don't even recognize them. We just take them for granted. It's just the world in which we live. But they're very, very important because they provide for our sense of social cohesion. It's how we live together. Right? There are all of these unspoken rules by which we operate, and it gives us this sense of this is who we are. This is how we do things. We don't even know what they are most of the time. They're there. We only recognize it when they get challenged. When a person or a group steps into our world and does not operate according to our kind of accepted norms. And when that happens, more often than not, our reaction is to perceive it as a threat and to try to stop it. If you've never seen the movie The Accountant, maybe a couple of years old now, it's Ben Affleck film. He's a autistic boy. He grows up to be a grown man, an accountant, and whatever. But as a boy, he goes to school and he gets bullied by other kids. And he asks his dad, why don't they like me? And his dad says, they don't like you, they don't not like you. You're different. And eventually, different is scary. It's a great summation, I think, of what happens when you are a follower of Jesus Christ and you are trying to embody the alternative world that Jesus is bringing to bear. You look different. And the difference challenges the social norm. I mean, it's like the line from that song, we're not going to fight your wars, we're not going to fall in line. I don't obey your rules. I don't live in the world as you define it. I live in a world as Jesus defines it, and I don't care what you think about that. And at some point, that bothers people. Come on, you know this. You ever been around somebody whose life, it just is a certain way, and they live according to a certain set of values, and when they're around you, it makes you feel uncomfortable. There's a sense of threat. That's why people get insulted and mocked and cursed for following Jesus. Because when you follow Christ, you're embodying a very different way of operating in the world. And the world does not know how to adjust to that. It feels threatening. And when you feel threatened, you lash out to eliminate the threat. According to Jesus, the way the world operates is a system of reciprocity. A system of quid pro quo. It's Latin, something for something. So Jesus says, what credit it is to you if you love those who love you? Even sinners do that. Why should you get credit for doing good to people who do good to you? Even sinners can do that. Why should you get credit for lending people who can repay you? Even sinners do that. And that word sinners is not a general word. It doesn't just mean like an immoral person. It's an actual category. So sinners were people who were labeled. They were Jews by birth, but they had no interest in following the law of Moses. So they didn't participate in a synagogue or temple. They violated the law of Moses, and so they were sort of shunned. And they were labeled sinners. What it tells you is that apart from supernatural influence, in Jesus' world, that's the law of Moses. That's God's commands. Apart from supernatural influence, human beings will just devolve to a system of reciprocity. We will love people who love us. We will do good to people who do good to us. We will lend to people who we think can repay us. That's just how we will operate. But then Jesus and his band of followers come along, and Jesus says, no, that's not how it's going to work in my world. You're not just going to love people who love you and do good to those who do good to you and lend to people who can repay you. You're going to love even your enemies. You're going to do good to people who hate you. You're going to lend to people who can't repay you, and you're not going to expect them to. Now, you can imagine if you lived in a world where everybody operated according to the assumption that we love those who love us, and we do good to those who do good to us, and we lend to people who can repay, and then these guys come along and say, no, we're not going to fall in line. We're not going to play by your rules. See, we're operating according to a higher ethic, something more foundational. It's not just a system of reciprocity. It's not about how we feel. It's not utilitarian. It's not about what we get out of it. It's anchored in something deeper and more foundational, more fundamental, truer. And so we're going to operate this way. You can understand that would be threatening. And that's why it's so important that we react the way that we do when insulted or mocked or cursed because we follow Jesus. It's a cycle. We get mocked, we get insulted, we get cursed because we follow Jesus. But our very way of expressing that we follow Jesus is responding to that mocking and insulting and cursing and hating with love and compassion. Because it's not about, again, it's characteristic of an alternative world. An alternative world that is rooted in something more foundational than how you feel or what you're going to get out of it. Jesus says it's anchored in the very character of God. That the reason that you love your enemies, the reason that you do good to the people who hate you and lend to those who can't repay, isn't because you feel like it. It isn't because they're going to become your best friend. It isn't because you're going to get something out of it or not get something out of it. It's because God is compassionate to the unthankful and the wicked. That's what Jesus says. And here's the thing. Unlike me, Jesus doesn't have to qualify. When he says something about God, he doesn't have to qualify it. Jesus consistently said things like, I'm the only one who knows the Father. I came from the Father. The Father and I are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So if Jesus looks at you and says, God is compassionate to the unthankful and the wicked, he doesn't have to defend that claim. You just believe that, if for no other reason, because Jesus rose from the dead. And when someone predicts that they're going to die, and then it happens, and predicts that he's going to rise from the dead, and then it happens, you pay attention to him. So if he looks at you and says, this is what God is like, I don't care what you think. Right? This is him saying, stop arguing with me. You do not know my dad. I'm the only one who knows him. I came from him. So I don't care what you think. In fact, stop thinking. God is compassionate to the unthankful and the wicked. That's what God is like. And he says, if you want to be God's children, in the same way that my children, both my biological children and my adoptive children, as scary as this is, the way that they reflect my nature, the way that they reflect me back to me, when I see them do things, when I hear something Ryder says, and I go, shoot, that's me. Oh, no. Right? In the same way that your kids reflect you back to you, the whole goal of this spiritual operation is you reflect God back to God. That you were created in a very particular image, and the whole point of this whole thing is that you might actually bear that image. You might actually live that way in the world. And what Jesus says, if you want to bear God's image back to God, this is how you do it. This is what it looks like. This is, you take it all the way to its logical, theological conclusion, take it as far as it can go, and this is what it's going to look like. It's going to look like you loving your enemies. You doing something that nobody else in the world does. And the reason you do it isn't because you feel like doing it. It isn't because it's good for you or it gets you something. I mean, I think it's interesting that Jesus says, he says both. He says your reward in heaven will be very great if you do this, and you'll be acting as my true children. I wonder how many people operate with this sort of framework in mind. Well, I'm going to do it because eventually I'm going to get something out of it, right? Very great rewards in heaven. Look, if that's where you are, that's cool, right? That's cool. You got to be a kid. My kids do things because of what they're going to get out of it. That's what it means to be a kid. You just probably shouldn't stay there. Like at some point you should transcend beyond that to, no, I do this because this is what it means to be a child of my Father. This is who my dad is. And so if I'm going to respect the name that I was given, this is what it looks like to live as a child of God. It means that we do things that the rest of the world does not do. We don't abide by a system of reciprocity. We don't live quid pro quo. We quit pro quo. we live according to an alternative ethic, a higher plane. That we follow a God who is compassionate. That's God's nature, God's essence. And so that means we too have to be compassionate, merciful. We have to make a vow, a commitment to the other person, to the person that we call enemy, to do good to them, to love them, to pray for them. Not to be their best friend, best buddy, not to hang out on the weekends, but that we model something. I really think this is one place, right? This is one place. Look, lots of different institutions feed hungry people. The church isn't the only institution that does that. A lot of institutions educate people. The church isn't the only ones that do that. A lot of institutions heal people, right? The church doesn't have a corner on that market. You know the one thing that the church can do that pretty much no other institution can do? Love our enemies. Because we're the only ones operating according to a transcendent command. The truth is we will not, and we've tried for a very long time, we will not approximate anything that looks like the kingdom of God by just following values. I don't care what the values are. I don't care if the value is individual rights or freedom or tolerance, or I don't care what they are. Eventually, where that will get you is a place where you sort of devolve into a system of reciprocity. You will be tolerant until you meet someone who's intolerant. Right? If you prioritize your individual rights, eventually your individual rights are gonna impinge on somebody else's. Eventually, it's going to devolve into a crass system of reciprocity, and that does not get us to the kingdom of God. The only thing that does that is a group of people saying, we won't fall in line. We're not going to play your game. We're quitting pro quo, and we're going to transcend that. We have a God whose essence is compassion, and so that's how we're going to be. And that will be most on display if you mock us or insult us or curse us because we follow Jesus. You want to see what Jesus is really like? Curse us, and you'll find out. So I want you to think about something this week. Two questions. The first is, I want you to think about, I gave you one, quid pro quo. That's a sort of standard operating procedure in the world. Maybe spend some time thinking about what are some other ones. What are some other just standard operating procedures in the world? Just the way that people operate, that if you were authentically following Jesus, you should be threatening to those things. And then I want you to ask yourself, have you ever actually been insulted or mocked or cursed or rejected because your life embodies the alternative way of Jesus? Has that ever actually happened to you? Has your life looked so radically different to the world in which you live that somebody just could not stand it? I'm going to do some soul searching there. How can we as the church be, right, the way the church is supposed to be?